Hi, everyone, and welcome to Last Week This Morning. This is a recap of the Energy Media's news coverage from last week, and Markham and I are going to have a little talk, a little back and forth about what we thought were the top stories. So I think we'll just launch right into it. I, the top of my mind this morning was what happened with Iran, and I was wondering, Markham, if you could give us a little perspective on that.
Well, Energy Media has kind of staked out a position on this because it's not being talked about in Canada. It's the oil industry that kind of dominates. The oil angle to this story is a natural one. I get it. I mean, we've had this many times before. Middle Eastern conflicts either drive up the price of oil because of risk. Or because of actual disruptions in supply. Now that we're not, I don't think we're going to see disruption in supply because the IEA was out this morning saying there's like OPEC alone has 5 million barrels a day of spare production capacity. So they could put more barrels in to replace Iran and anybody else that if there's disruption. Our angle on this is that geopolitical conflict uh, acts as a disruption for the energy transition. And we saw this with when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, particularly in Europe, where they brought in the Repower EU strategy, which had three
Mhm.
parts. So energy efficiency, increase energy efficiency, replace existing oil and gas supplies, Russian oil and gas supplies with other suppliers, did that, and they're rolling out renewables, yeah, a lot more, and also on the demand side, electric vehicles and heat pumps. And they basically that had been their strategy, but they are now accelerating it, and so they have much higher targets for 2040 than they had before. And here we are 3 years later, and it looks like we may very well have a repeat of that. So I think that's this is not an angle that we cover much in Canada.
So back to the disruption and what this might cause. We've seen similar things in the past, but where is this one going to be different, or is it going to be a repeat?
Really hard to say. I mean, we'll see what Iran has promised retaliation against the U.S. and Israel. It's already been lobbing some missiles at Israel, and but just how far does it go? And there's some questions about Iran's military preparedness, that it doesn't have the air power and certainly not the ground troops to respond to Israel, on and on. So this may turn out to be not as serious as Russia invading Ukraine, or Iran might behave differently than some of the analysts I've been reading, and it turns out to be as bad as. And because 70% of Asia's oil, or 70% of the oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. And all of the oil demand scenarios that you read, if they're put the emphasis on what does Asia do between now and 2050? Does it stick with oil and gas, or does it, under the influence of China, electrify? And
Right.
if Asia, and this maybe is this is something else we talked about last week, and it's related here, is the redefinition of energy security. Energy security used to be
Right.
defined as uh, an adequate supply of oil and gas at a reasonable price. Now it's being defined as, and particularly in Asia, you buy energy technology on the supply side, like wind and solar, and then you adopt technology on the demand side, like electric vehicles and heat pumps. And you actually, once you've bought it, then you can generate electricity with it 25 years, 30 years, 40 years. I mean, it'll go for a long time. So instead of importing all the time and having to spend precious foreign currency on oil and gas imports and LNG imports, you buy this technology once, and you produce your energy domestically. So you're not
Right.
vulnerable to disruptions in markets and disruptions in supply, like we are today.
Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up is just we've got the potential here that this is just one other disruption that's just going to put in the mind the global south. Let's just electrify and stop our dependency going forward. So I want to switch gears here a little bit And I want to start talking. Last week we you had a professor on, Professor Madeline McPherson, and we talked about you talked about a nation building project. And for me, that's where I start to get excited because I think, okay, what could we do? What can we do to support Canada moving forward in electrification? And she talked about, you know, how the system works now, how our electricity system works now, and how individualized it really is province by province. So that's kind of a shock for me, I think. I know a little bit, but her view was really important. And I was just wondering, what did you come out of that interview thinking, and where do you think Canada can go from here?
Madeline McPherson is a professor at the University of Victoria, and she spent the last 10, 12 years modeling changes in the Canadian electricity system. And I've never met anybody who knows that system as well as she does. And this issue of how do we integrate power grids, because we really have three of them. We've got a sort of BC to Manitoba, and then you've got Quebec and Ontario, and then you've got the Atlantic Loop. Those are the three sort of natural regional grids. And
Right.
the idea of having one Canadian grid, now that was floated by Mark Carney. That was a big part of the Liberals' election campaign. And he's been talking a lot about it since the Liberals formed government again. But as Madeline pointed out, make uniting those three regions into one grid is a really, really difficult thing. Like how do you, if
Yeah.
you're going to join Manitoba to Ontario and you've got to go over the Northern Shield and, through Northern Ontario and through Eastern Manitoba. I mean, I've driven that highway. It's nothing but granite and,
Yeah.
it'd be tough. So that's very high cost. And she suggests like maybe we have three regional grids, be
Correct. Yeah.
so there's and then there are all kinds of other issues that technical. Some of them are technical, some of them are political. Because in the West we've got Alberta, which has the only deregulated system in Canada.
Right.
How does Alberta play with it's a private system? How does it play with the crown corporations in BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba? How so not all of the systems don't all use the same voltage and frequency. There's just it's not like just plugging them together and like an erector set and away you go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that this brings up another topic that we had a webinar last week where we had on Dr. Jared Finnegan, and we talked about the politics of the energy transition. And a lot of what you cover here with this, possible nation building project is the energy transition is inherently political. And you know, I found that kind of interesting. And then we also talked about last week was just, you know, who do you believe? We've got Daniel Smith, who is OPEC forever, and we've got our federal government, who is the IEA, and it believes, that peak oil might be coming sooner than we think. So, what's your idea around the energy transition in politics?
There's a couple of angles to the story, and I think it's absolutely fascinating the corner that Carney has painted himself into, because internal free trade within Canada, between all the 10 provinces and the three territories, was a big part of his economic platform, and he's barreling ahead with that. He's got the One Canada Act, Bill C-5, that passed the House, the Commons, House of Commons, and so he's going ahead with that. But that means Alberta's got to be on board. And Alberta, I mean, Danielle Smith, this is like a gift from heaven for her, because all of the demands that she's been making, which is build pipelines, expand production, roll back regulations, those are her three demands. She can use that as leverage, or Carney's desire to get the provinces working together on free trade and other issues. She can use that as leverage to get him to make promises on her three demands. And how he tiptoes around that, because on the weekend, David Eby, the premier of BC, came out and said, no, we're not interested in a pipeline. He'd been kind of a little wishy-washy about it, but now he's put his cards on the table and he said, no, we're not interested. That brings up I mean, the politics of that we saw in Trans Mountain expansion, 7, 8, 10 years ago. I mean, protests and the BC government taking the federal government to court, and it was vicious. I think it'd be worse this time. So
Right.
Carney's political skills, trying to come up with a compromise that works for Alberta and works for BC and Saskatchewan, I guess. That is going to be, we need to watch that. We'll see if he can do it because it's a lot more challenging, I think, than we maybe agree. The sort of the national discussion we're having makes it sound like it might be easier than it really is.
Yeah, well, and you brought up a good point about the carbon tax, where there just wasn't enough of a political consensus created. And here we are again with a big, potentially big project, big question, big discussion around pipelines. And I'm not sure that there is political consensus. So, if Mark Carney's going to do it differently than Trudeau, he's going to have to build that up and get the messaging right and, get a lot more people on board if we don't want another political fail like we saw with the carbon tax.
Well, it's interesting the way Carney's approaching this because I thought that Trudeau made two fundamental errors. One of them is big focus on climate. And, here at Energy Media, our position is we don't talk about climate, not because we don't think it's a crisis, not because we don't agree with the climate science. It's because it becomes once you talk about climate, it becomes a moral issue. It's do I believe this? Don't I believe that? Do I believe the science? And this we focus instead, in our energy transition theory of change focuses on technology change, markets, consumers, prices and costs, those sorts of things. And we've gone in front of, you remember that webinar I did for the Alberta engineers last November. We had 630 engineers. And I thought I was going to get roasted. I really did. I mean, that is not my crowd as a rule. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. And one guy said, and I think this speaks for the many of the others, he said, finally, somebody explained the energy transition the way an engineer thinks about it. It's not
Right.
political. It's not about climate policy. It's not about that. It's about technology change and markets and all the stuff I just mentioned. So that's one thing. I mean, Carney is still talking about climate in the way that Trudeau did, and I'm not sure if that's going to make his job tougher, in my opinion. The second thing he did, and this is what we talked about with Jared in the webinar, is Trudeau brought in the policies. He did some work up front to build political support for a carbon tax, and then he just kind of abandoned it. Just uh, he didn't continue to provide political support. There were all kinds of communication problems. There were, people, the money
Right.
would show up in your bank account, you wouldn't know where it came from because it was labeled poorly, that sort of thing. And so that then provided an opening for the conservatives, and Pierre Poilievre exploited that with his Axe the Tax campaign, and he basically destroyed the political constituency that Trudeau had created but then not maintained. So there is a big lesson here for Carney. And that is
Yeah.
whatever you do around economic policy, whether it's internal free trade, whether it's build pipe, you have to put a lot of political capital and attention into those projects and policies, or they're not going to succeed. And so he's got to.
Yeah.
I would not want to be in Mark Carney's shoes. And he's created some of his own problems. Like he keeps talking about, Canada being an energy superpower, which no, that it really hasn't been part of the national conversation for years. But he brought it
Yeah.
back. And then as soon as
Yeah.
he did, and he said, well, yeah, and that includes conventional energy, which Danielle Smith said, well, that means oil and gas. And in oil and gas, you get it to market through a pipeline. Yahoo!
Yeah.
No, he just
Yeah.
he handed it to her, and she ran with it. Give her credit. She knows how to play this game. So that just makes Carney's job tougher. So we're going to watch this. We're going to be reporting on it, and in the weeks and months ahead, because I think that this fall after the lull of the summer, things are going to get pretty volatile. Particularly between Alberta and BC.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think this has been a really good recap of what we covered last week. We've got a lot to look forward coming into this week. And I hope people will tune in every Monday. we're going to do this little discussion and kind of do some of the highlights in case can't keep up with the amount of coverage we have every week. And yeah, just I just want to encourage people to subscribe to the channel. And we also have memberships available if you want to support us and like the work that we're doing. You can also, buy a membership right here on the channel. So did you
Yes,
want to
we
have the final
really.
word, Markham?
Well, I want to repeat what you said about supporting us. We really appreciate it. Our subscriptions have, I mean, we had what, 6,000 in January, middle of
Yep,
January, and now we're on our way. We just passed 22,000.
yep,
16,000 in 4 or 5 months. That's pretty considerable growth. So people clearly like what we're doing,
yep.
and we already have 35 or 40 members who are committing to a monthly subscription fee of anywhere from $4.99 to $24.99. So we really appreciate this, folks. But we have big plans here at Energy Media. I mean, we have tapped into something. We're getting big readership numbers, sorry, viewership numbers. I mean, what is that story we did about the border? I think it's either 300,000 or gone over 300,000. We're getting big numbers on some of these stories, and there's a real appetite for the kind of approach to energy and journalism that we bring. And so we're just going to bring you more of it.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thanks everyone who took the time to listen, and we'll see you next Monday.
See you next Monday.